This talk is focused on common problems in published thematic analysis research, and it's based on a review of 100 papers published in 5 health psychology journals. Just to emphasize that this is work in progress, we have looked at 4 out of the 5 journals. We've done an initial kind of survey of the journal articles in the 5th journal, so we're still kind of developing our ideas, and we're going to present some kind of questions as well as kind of definitive conclusions about the research that we've reviewed. This piece of work is a collaboration with my frequent TA and qualitative methods co-author, Virginia or Ginny Brown from the University of Auckland, and here she is wearing the medal that she was awarded by the New Zealand Association of Scientists, the Marsden Medal for a lifetime of achievement in the social sciences. If you're not familiar with our work, Ginny and I have been writing about thematic analysis in particular, but also qualitative methods more broadly, since we first published a paper about TA in 2006. This is the paper on the right-hand side, using thematic analysis in psychology. To our great surprise, because we were very sort of specialist gender and sexuality researchers talking to very small audiences, this is where our first entry into the world of methodological scholarship. We didn't anticipate this paper having any particular impact or uptake, but it now has around, I think, over 120,000 Google Scholar citations or something like that. So it's been very impactful, to our great surprise, as I said. Our most recent work in the area is our book, Thematic Analysis, A Practical Guide, which provides a full-length articulation of the approach that we've developed and also situates it in relation to the family of thematic analysis methods more broadly. So what we're going to do today is review the use and reporting of thematic analysis in 5 health psychology journals and look at how health psychology is using TA, but also identify some areas of problematic practice. We've looked at 5 journals: Journal of Health Psychology, British Journal of Health Psychology, Psychology and Health. These 3 were chosen because Jonathan Smith, in a review of interpretative phenomenological research, identified these journals as publishing high quality IPA. So we wanted to see if they were similarly publishing high quality TA. He also argued that medical journals tended to publish the lowest quality IPA, so we added Psychology, Health and Medicine into our sample, in inverted commas, as that's a problematic concept in qualitative research, to see whether the TA reported in this journal was particularly problematic. And then, because we were conscious that the word count limits for journals, particularly in applied areas, can constrain how qualitative research is reported, we chose an open access journal, Psychology, Health Psychology Open, which has no word count restraints. So we wanted to see if the lack of limitations around word count allows researchers to present their research in more detail. So Health Psychology Open is the journal that we haven't looked at in detail yet. That's currently in progress. I just wanted to briefly give you a sense of the context for qualitative research in health psychology in case it's not something that's familiar. In terms of qualitative methods, they are increasingly recognized and valued within health psychology. The real driver for this has been an emphasis on listening to patient voices, hence the stethoscope on the slide, and understanding patients' experiences of treatment and interventions and so on. At the same time, health psychology as a field remains dominated by a scientific psychology model of research. So the norms and the values of scientific psychology still continue to kind of shape the field. So on the one hand, you have increasing acknowledgement of qualitative research, but on the other, you have this ongoing dominance of quantitative research values and norms. So although qualitative approaches are increasingly recognized, increasingly used, increasingly embraced, the they're done so in a context that still places a high value on scientific psychology. And I think that's probably true of many research fields and disciplines. It's not unique to health psychology. So why did we decide to conduct a critical review and reflection and look at 100 papers in health psychology? Well, we've been thinking a lot about quality and thematic analysis recently and how we can encourage and support researchers to engage in good quality practice. And as well as writing more generally about quality, we thought it would be a useful exercise to look at how TA is being used in a particular kind of field of research and understand what good and bad practice looks like. Similar state-of-the-art reviews have been conducted for qualitative research more broadly in health and related fields such as sport and exercise. And there's also been this kind of review done for particular methods and methodologies. I've already mentioned Smith's review of IPA. There's other reviews of IPA. And there's also reviews that have been done of published grounded theory research. So in terms of our approach to the review, it broadly conforms to what Bradbury Jones and colleagues call a focused mapping review and synthesis. I have to say that word slowly because I have a lisp. And it's focused because it's looking at a particular subject. So it's looking at the method of TA and the field of health psychology. It's looking at a defined time period, 2015 to 2019, and it's looking in specific predetermined journals, the 5 journals I mentioned previously. So in terms of our sample, again in inverted commas, we're looking at papers, as I mentioned, published in a 5-year period from 2015 to 2019. We wanted to look at several years so that there would be enough papers using TA that we could draw into our review. That was less of a concern with the Journal of Health Psychology and the British Journal of Health Psychology, which publish lots of TA, but more of a concern with Psychology, Health and Medicine. We also decided to stop the review at 2019 because we were conscious that we were working on various papers on quality in TA and reflecting on our reflexive TA approach. And we wanted to see what was going on in research before those papers kind of got out there in the world and people started reading with them and engaging with them. So we focused on this 5-year period. In terms of how we generated the sample of papers, we used the advanced search function on each journal website. We searched for thematic analysis, and then we went through the search results, and for each paper we checked if it used the term thematic analysis in the title, the abstract, or the main body of the paper. And we also checked that it actually reported some kind of thematic analysis, not that it was just using that term. And then for each journal, we stopped when we got to 20 papers. We obviously included qualitative designs, but we also decided to include mixed methods designs and papers using TA for qualitative systematic review or meta-synthesis. And we didn't exclude papers that we'd co-authored. So I think we're both co-authors on at least one paper in the review. Because we wanted to be inclusive because we wanted to understand how TA is being used in health psychology rather than focusing specifically on qualitative research. Although the reflexive TA approach that we've developed was very widely cited in the sample of papers, we decided that we wanted to focus on TA more broadly, what we call the TA family of methods, rather than a particular member of the family, and particularly our approach, reflexive TA. And we decided to take this broader approach because we're very conscious that the diversity within TA is often very poorly understood, and that feeds into some of the common problems that we're going to talk about. That TA is often assumed to be a single method with one set of procedures, or if there are differences in procedures, they're not thought to be particularly kind of important or things to kind of worry about. And so we see authors citing different TA approaches and using procedures from different TA approaches. To briefly give you a flavour of some of the diversity within the TA family, Linda Finlay, a psychotherapy researcher, in a recent paper has a really nice distinction between scientifically descriptive and artfully interpretive TA. So TA runs the kind of full spectrum of qualitative inquiry. On the one hand, you have TA that conceptualizes qualitative research as using qualitative techniques, but within the kind of disciplinary dominant framework, which in health psychology and in many other fields is positivism. So it can be seen as a form of kind of positivist TA, in that it worries about the things that quantitative researchers are concerned with: reliability, replicability, generalizability, and so on. So there's a lot of stress on making sure that coding of data is accurate and reliable. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have approaches like the reflexive TA approach that we've developed, that take a very different approach to qualitative research. That qualitative research isn't just viewed as using particular tools and techniques, that it's about using these techniques within a particular set of research values, where researcher subjectivity is embraced, where knowledge is viewed as contextual and situated, that the idea of objective knowledge is rejected, and so on. So there's a real diversity within TA. And as we go on to discuss, the lack of understanding of this diversity is where we see common problems stemming from. Another really important distinction that I want to briefly highlight is between themes as buckets, diamonds, or stories. So in some types of TA, themes are conceptualized as topic summaries, or as one of my students memorably put it, bucket themes, in the sense that the researcher grabs a bucket, slaps on a label like benefits, and chucks in all the data into the bucket that's relevant to that topic area. And they don't really think about the relationship between the data. If there's a story there, it's just, here's everything the participants said about benefits. You also have a understanding of themes as kind of diamonds in the sand, in the sense that they're real things, that they pre-exist analysis, and the researcher's role is to identify or discover or find the themes, or even hopefully the themes might just emerge from the data, like Botticelli's Venus arriving at the shore. That when themes are conceptualized as diamonds, there's often a tendency to position the researcher as quite passive, that they're merely kind of discovering or scooping up the themes, that they don't play an active role in theme development. A contrasting way of thinking about themes is themes as interpretive stories. So here, themes aren't seen as real, they're not seen as things that pre-exist analysis, and they're also not just a summary of data relating to a particular topic. Instead, they're rich and multifaceted patterns of shared meaning that are organized around a central concept or a central idea, and that they're created by the researcher through intense analytic engagement. So the researcher is very active in the process of creating themes as interpretive stories. And the TA family differ on how themes are conceptualized. So scientifically descriptive approaches tend to go for themes as buckets and diamonds, whereas more reflexive approaches tend to conceptualize themes as interpretive stories. I'll just very briefly talk through the areas for review. Some were descriptive, so what was the research question, how many participants were there? And some were more interpretive or evaluative. So for example, we classified the research questions into the typology that Ginny and I have developed for qualitative research questions. Some of the categories, the areas for review, we developed in advance, and then some we developed as we started to kind of read the paper and think about what was important in the papers and how TA was being reported. So I've just given you some examples there of descriptive areas for review. So looking at the design, the methods, the participants, looking at the researcher owning their perspective. So do they articulate their theoretical assumptions? Do they talk about reflexivity or researcher bias? We were particularly interested in how the papers engaged with TA, reported TA. So we were looking at how researchers were conceptualizing themes, the number of themes they were reporting, the particular kind of characteristics of their thematic structure, how they were using data to kind of illustrate and evidence analytic claims. And we're also looking at quality practice. So we amused ourselves with a area of review called Crimes Against TA, where we were looking at identifying kind of common problems and so on. In terms of how TA is used in health psychology, it's probably used in health psychology in the same way that it's used in many disciplines and fields of research, in that it's mostly used in what we call experiential qualitative research. So research that's focused on participants and their lived experiences, their subjective sense making, their views, their motivations, their needs, their behaviors. Obviously in health psychology, this is particularly in relation to kind of illness and treatment and health behaviors. When theory was discussed in the papers, it tended to be in keeping with this experiential orientation, so phenomenological realist, critical realist, contextualist. Um, Qualitative designs predominated. There were quite a few mixed method studies as well, and in each journal there were some systematic reviews as well. And because of this focus on lived experience, methods tended to be used to collect self-report data, and interviews overwhelmingly predominated in methods of data generation. And research tended to be focused on patients or significant others of patients and health professionals, and looking at their particular experiences and sense making. As I mentioned, reflexive TA overwhelmingly predominated. Our 2006 paper was the most commonly cited source for TA in the British Journal of Health Psychology, and the Journal of Health Psychology, I think all but one of the papers in the sample cited either that paper or another one of our papers. Other sources for TA were cited, along with sources for grounded theory and thematic coding. So thematic coding is when people use grounded theory coding techniques to develop a set of themes. So essentially using grounded theory techniques to do thematic analysis, and also sources for content analysis. Most papers used or claimed to use TA as a standalone method, but there were instances of TA being combined with other methods, so grounded theory or content analysis. And TA was typically used inductively and descriptively with data extracts in most papers. Not always. There are a few papers, particularly in psychology, health and medicine, where there were no data extracts presented. Data extracts were used to illustrate analytic observations. So overall, the research we reviewed evidences what Sandalowski calls the factist take on data. So the data were treated as evidencing something real and confirmable about the experiences being studied. So in this way, qualitative research in health psychology is little different from quantitative research. It has the same broad kind of orientation or take on data. And Chamberlain and Murray in 2008 commented that they felt that qualitative health psychology was by and large descriptive, with little in the way of depth and interpretive commentary on data. And this is true of quite a bit of the research that was included in the review, that it tended towards the descriptive rather than the more interpretative end of the spectrum. So our overall conclusion when it comes to how health psychologists are using TA is they're not really harnessing the flexibility of TA. That TA has lots of flexibility when it comes to methods of data collection. It's not just about analysing interviews or focus groups or qualitative surveys. That it's not just about doing research in an experiential mode and asking research questions about lived experience. So we'd really like to see health psychologists kind of engage with the full possibilities that TA offers them. So now I'm going to move on to talk about 10 problematic practices that we've identified from the review. Firstly, there's treating TA as homogeneous or singular. So I talked previously about the diversity within the TA family and how poorly this is recognised. This was very much reflected in the papers we reviewed. Secondly, mischaracterising TA. And then there is not providing a rationale for the choice of TA, or providing a rationale that's rather weak. Failing to theoretically locate the author's use of TA, and often they ended up defaulting to the kind of disciplinary dominant norms of positivism, perhaps unknowingly without kind of being conscious of doing this. There's also a failure to research and report reflexively, in particularly important for reflexive TA, and also confusing researcher reflexivity with positivist notions of researcher bias. Common problem number 6 is a lack of transparency and detail in the description of the analytic process. Then confusion over what constitutes a deductive orientation to data, and there's diversity within the TA family about how a deductive orientation is conceptualized, but this didn't seem to be well understood. Probably one of the Most common problems is confusing topic summaries with shared meaning themes, themes as interpretive stories, and themes are often poorly named and treated as real, as diamonds in the sand in reflexive TA, when that isn't how themes are typically conceptualized. Another problem related to themes is that there are often too many themes and not many observations, and the net result was a very fragmented thematic structure with no sense of the overall story of the analysis. And then finally, lots of examples of theoretically incoherent quality practices and standards. So doing reflexive TA, claiming to be a interpretative kind of artist, but using scientifically descriptive quality practices. So we'll now look at each of these in a bit more detail. In the paper's review, TA was very commonly treated as a homogeneous or singular method. If different TA sources were cited, there was no acknowledgement of divergences in procedures and underlying research values, different conceptualizations of what deduction means, or different understandings of themes. There wasn't any particular open discussion around this, but this diversity makes knowing deliberative practice really important. It's really important that researchers are clear about what kind of TA they're doing and where it fits in the landscape of TA, and what kinds of conceptualizations of themes and researcher subjectivity are consistent with the approach that they're using. So things like references to standard TA procedures really kind of clued us into this idea that TA is being treated as something singular, and we're not aware of kind of any standard kind of TA procedures. There's lots of diversity and lots of differences out there. A 2006 paper was frequently cited, but it wasn't always clear why it was being cited. So was it just a reference for TA as a kind of general broad approach? Was it being referenced to support the use of a particular kind of TA process? So people might talk about familiarization and then cite the paper. Or was it being cited because the authors had engaged with the particular kind of procedures and sensibility we outlined? Sometimes it was clear, sometimes it wasn't clear the purpose of citation. So overall, we're left with this sense of a lack of understanding of the diversity within TA. Often felt that TA was mischaracterized, and that there was a lack of appreciation of the diversity of TA, the flexibility of TA, and the range of different ways it can be utilized in qualitative research. And the rationales provided for combining TA with other approaches were particularly telling in this regard. So for example, researchers justified combining TA and grounded theory because TA was seen as only descriptive. That's obviously not a view that we would accept. That TA was both inadequately inductive and inadequately deductive, so it had to be combined with content analysis or grounded theory to kind of boost the induction or boost the deduction. Another common assertion was that TA wasn't a particularly kind of rigorous method. This is one that we obviously don't agree with. The reason why I've got Ella Fitzgerald here is because she's famous for singing a song, "It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it." And I think this is really important when it comes to rigor in TA research. So it isn't about the procedures, it's how you engage with them as a researcher. That's where rigor comes from. You can try and treat the procedures like a recipe book and follow them as you would a baking recipe, but that won't guarantee that the research is good quality. It's being a knowing and reflexively engaged researcher that makes your TA good quality. Another claim was that TA doesn't allow for both inductive and deductive analysis, and this is one of the core characteristics of TA in pretty much every iteration of TA that we've come across, that it does allow for both these orientations to data. Another claim was that TA doesn't allow for developing relationships between themes, so it has to be supplemented with grounded theory so the researchers can understand the relationship between themes. Again, I think pretty much every TA source talks about both developing themes but also thinking about the relationship with themes. So we think that there's a lack of understanding of the possibilities of TA, and the researchers need to perhaps do a better job of improving their knowledge around TA before they use it as a method. Half the papers we reviewed didn't provide any kind of rationale for the use of TA. In papers that did provide a rationale, one really common practice was to kind of cite generic characteristics or strengths of TA, so flexibility, accessibility, but not actually explain how they were relevant to the research or how the researchers harness those qualities in their research. Papers often centered pragmatic and practical rationales rather than ones that were related to the design and the purpose of the research. So they would talk about the fact that they've used the method before or it's widely used within health psychology. And sometimes rationales were so generic that they could apply to almost any analytic approach. So people talked about they used TA to kind of integrate the data. Well, I think you could probably say that of almost any qualitative analytic approach, that you can use it to integrate data. And sometimes when people were providing a rationale for taking a particular orientation, these were really almost tautological. So we used an inductive orientation to kind of ground the analysis in the data. So we essentially, they're saying we used an inductive orientation to be inductive. So we felt that overall the rationales weren't particularly strong and compelling. But we are reflecting on the fact that we do often select methods for pragmatic reasons because they're familiar to us, they're familiar to our supervisor or mentor. And most qualitative researchers aren't trained in a cornucopia of methods. They can't think, oh, well, I'll do grounded theory here, and for that study, I'll do narrative. That isn't a realistic kind of possibility for most of us. And we wonder whether we should reveal more of the mess, the behind the scenes of the research when we're giving rationales, because what matters most is that your choice is coherent, that it works for your study, not that you have a fancy or an academically appropriate kind of sounding rationale. So I think this is something that we need to kind of think about as a community of scholars, is how we justify our choices and what's most important when it comes to articulating our research designs. Is it that our rationales sound serious and academic, or is it that we're actually honest about the choices that we make? And as long as our research designs are coherent, that's what really matters. Diversity within the TA family, and because TA is just a method rather than a theoretically informed and delimited methodology, is really important for researchers to kind of own their theoretical perspective, the theoretical underpinnings of their use of TA, and locate their use of TA theoretically. What we found in the review is only a small number of papers actually addressed the theoretical underpinnings of the TA research, that typically this wasn't mentioned at all. And there were very few references to any levels or kinds of theory. So we can think of kind of philosophical theory, ontological and epistemological theory, and then kind of what might be seen as a lower level theory, so explanatory theory. Very little engagement with theory. So we have to ask if this is content that editors and reviewers don't see as important, because obviously we've looked at peer-reviewed research. So the research doesn't just reflect the choices and the decisions of the researchers, but also the views and the beliefs of the editors and the reviewers. So this is clearly not content that is seen as particularly important. We're also wondering whether there's a misunderstanding of TA as atheoretical, and so you don't need to discuss theory, but obviously no method can be atheoretical. Researchers are always making assumptions about the nature of reality, about what constitutes meaningful knowledge and what data represent. They might not be aware that they're making these assumptions, but they're still making them nonetheless. So this is why we see the idea of content analysis as being atheoretical is a bit implausible, because we don't think that's possible for any analytic method. There's also perhaps a lack of understanding of the kind of diversity within TA, and that if you're a TA researcher, you might be a descriptive scientist, you might be an interpretive artist. And so you really need to kind of articulate what your assumptions are. And so in lots of papers, we saw a defaulting to the disciplinary kind of dominant values of positivism and realism. So there was lots of discussions of researcher bias, this kind of positive conceptualization of researcher influence as potentially kind of distorting idealized objective knowledge, and references to coding bias and concerns about the accuracy of coding, the reliability of coding, the objectivity of coding, and so on. So in lots of papers that were claiming to use reflexive TA, we saw this kind of mashing up of the qualitative research values of reflexive TA with the kind of positivist research values that kind of dominate within the wider field of health psychology. I just wanted to share this lovely quotation from Marasek. She talks about psychologists swimming in the waters of logical positivism, empiricism, realism, and quantification without knowing they're wet, which I think beautifully captures what we were seeing in lots of the papers we reviewed. Also wanted to give an example of good practice when it comes to discussing theoretical assumptions. This doesn't have to be hugely detailed. We're not expecting this to take up a huge chunk of the word count. So I picked out an example here that's around 100 words long. I won't read through it, but it's there for you to have a look at to get a sense of what good practice looks like. Papers in the review, there wasn't any discussion of reflexivity. When reflexivity was discussed, it tended to be what Wilkinson called personal reflexivity, so focusing on the professional or the personal details of the researcher. In a few papers, authors noted that they kept a reflexive journal, but there wasn't really any detailed discussion of what this meant for the analysis. So researcher subjectivity was also often framed in terms of bias or as a potential influence, so something kind of separate from the research. You've got the research there, and then you've got the researcher kind of external to it, potentially kind of acting on and distorting the research. Whereas in a more qualitative conceptualization, the researcher is an integral part of the research process, that they can't be kind of separated out from it and kind of act on it, that they're producing the research, generating the research. Some papers reference both researcher bias and reflexivity, so we're kind of flip-flopping between positivist notions of researcher bias and qualitative notions of reflexivity, but lots of quality standards do this as well, so I don't think we can really see this as a huge problem, because researchers are just following what's reflected in kind of quality standards. And we also saw a lot of third person writing, so writing out the researcher from the report. And again, this is where health psychology reporting reflects the kind of disciplinary dominant norms and values of scientific psychology. So third person writing is the norm there, but it doesn't work well always for qualitative research. Particularly reflexive TA needs a kind of different style of writing. And we question whether this was a knowing practice, whether researchers were engaged in reflexivity in a deliberative way, or whether they were just kind of defaulting to kind of what's expected. There were very few examples in the papers we reviewed of researchers linking their personal or their professional positioning to their reflexive practice, to their analysis of the data. So we wanted to give you another example of good practice. I should say that this is a paper that I'm a co-author on, so perhaps not too surprising that has some more detailed discussion of reflexivity. Again, I won't read it out, but I just wanted to have it on the slide so you've got it as an example of what good or better reflexive practice might look like, even within sort of relatively constrained journal word counts. Within TA, make transparency around the analytic process really important. And unfortunately, this was often missing in a lot of the papers that we looked at. It was rather disturbingly common for authors to say that they followed the procedures of Brown and Clarke and then outlined things that were completely different to what we discuss in our work. So we did wonder if people were actually citing our paper without reading it, or having an understanding that different approaches to TA are quite different. And so if you kind of have actually read Boyatzis, but you chuck in a citation to Brown and Clarke, they're not the same. They don't offer kind of similar methods. Descriptions of the analytic process were often minimal, so people might kind of recite the 6 phases of reflexive TA, but not really discuss how they engage with those processes and their kind of unique take on them, so kind of treating them a bit like a recipe that was followed, rather than kind of talking about how they kind of engaged in the process. So TA seems to kind of have developed into a kind of brand name. So a nice quotation here that researchers cite existing methods or models for analysis as brand names, but without offering any further details. When reading the analysis, the reader may be given only a general understanding of the method used. The specific and unique application that is relevant to the study is not, however, presented. And this captures beautifully what we were seeing in the review. Kind of, we use this branded method, but we're not going to tell you any more about how exactly we used it. So we wanted to give you another good practice example here. So this is Flowers and colleagues talking about how they engaged with our reflexive TA approach. And it gives a really nice example of what I was talking about, of kind of really opening up how the researchers kind of engaged with the method, how they made it their own, rather than just kind of reciting, here are the 6 phases and we followed them. See lots of confusion in the papers around what constitutes a deductive orientation to TA, and we often could see kind of mashups between, for example, reflexive TA and then other approaches to kind of deduction and TA. So using data collection questions as themes, using pre-existing theory to create a coding frame, using predetermined themes or determining analytic focus in advance are all ways of thinking about deduction in TA in other TA approaches. In reflexive TA, we emphasize that theory provides an interpretive lens for kind of making sense of data. So Flowers and colleagues here really kind of nail that kind of understanding of deduction in reflexive TA. One of the most common problems is definitely researchers mashing up reflexive TA and topic summaries. So in reflexive TA, themes are very much interpretive stories, but there are loads of papers in the review where people are claiming to do reflexive TA, but then reporting topic summaries. So the themes were a summary of responses to a data collection question, for example, that there wasn't really any analytic work that had been done beyond kind of summarizing how participants had responded to a particular question. Sometimes there was a thematic structure where the themes signaled the topic area, and then shared meaning was kind of evident at the level of the sub-theme. So the theme might be experiences of X, and then each sub-theme captured a different facet of the experience, but then there was no sort of overall story around the sub-themes. Sometimes themes were shared meaning themes when we read through the paper, but the themes weren't particularly well named, often just a one-word name or just naming the topic. And so although it is possible for one-word theme names to work well, we think these are kind of generally avoided to really underscore that if you're doing reflexive TA, that you've understood that themes are interpretive stories. And another problem that we could see is people treating kind of themes as kind of diamonds in the sand. So this idea that themes are real, that they pre-exist the data, that researchers identify or discover them, or that they just emerge from the data. So we see a lot of themes being treated as diamonds in reflexive TA. I won't talk through this in detail, but again, I just wanted to give an example of good practice that's there to look at if you'd like to, of themes as interpretive stories. So this was an analysis of 3 themes, with the first theme having 2 sub-themes, and you can see from the titles like Trust Me, I'm a YouTuber or Health for the Right Reasons that these themes aren't just kind of summarizing topics, that they're telling interpretive stories around particular aspects of the data. Another problem with regard to themes was the tendency to report a really large number of themes. So I think one paper had over 50 themes that were reported, but the themes were often quite thin. So they contained kind of one small observation, and that was the theme. And so the overall sense of the thematic structure was that it was really fragmented, and that there wasn't a sense of an overall story that kind of drew everything together. The other problem that we had when we were reviewing was actually working out what the themes were, that although around half the papers had really nice overviews in the form of tables or figures or just a simple list of themes, that in quite a few of the papers it wasn't always clear what the themes were. So there were headings in the analysis and it wasn't clear if that was a theme or a sub-theme. So it wasn't always straightforward to determine how themes were reported. Sometimes authors would kind of identify that they were going to discuss 3 themes, but then there were lots of other headings in the analysis, and we weren't sure what these were. Were they sub-themes because they weren't kind of discussed in the overview? And generally speaking, there was a really large number of themes kind of relative to the space available. So the analytic narrative often did very little other than kind of minimally kind of string together some data quotations. That themes weren't rich, kind of multifaceted, complex, that they were often quite thin kind of descriptive summaries. The final point I want to note is the use of theoretically incoherent quality practices and standards. That it's really important to note that quality practices and standards are rarely theoretically neutral, that they're embedded with theoretical assumptions. And lots of common practices like member checking, saturation, and triangulation are realist, and they're not methodologically coherent with approaches like reflexive TA. And things like measuring intercoder agreement and consensus coding are positivist and also not coherent with reflexive TA. Overall, there seemed to be a huge emphasis on agreeing themes or checking and verifying themes with another researcher. So not everyone was kind of measuring intercoder agreement, but they were still emphasizing that the themes had been agreed. And this isn't something that we see as compatible with the sensibility of reflexive TA. And sources like Lincoln and Guber were often cited, for example, without any acknowledgement that they kind of abandoned the foundationalist epistemology that underpinned their initial discussion of quality. So they're kind of very well known for talking about member checking and talking about triangulation, but within a few years, they'd kind of abandoned that approach to qualitative research and were emphasizing different quality criteria. So I just want to very briefly end with 3 recommendations: that qualitative researchers need more words, that they need longer word counts to do justice to their reports of their TA. And this doesn't necessarily mean having longer paper lengths. It means that researchers can make use of supplementary online materials, which have less cost implications for journals because they're generally uploaded as kind of Word documents or PowerPoint, so they don't need kind of copy editing. And authors can use these to kind of expand on their discussion of their methodology. They can use it for more space for kind of reflexivity and so on. So we think that we need to change how we think about reporting qualitative research to make sure that there's enough space to discuss everything that's important. Related to this, qualitative researchers need new styles of reporting, that using the norms and values of scientific psychology doesn't really work for anything other than scientifically descriptive TA, that we need to be open to and embrace new languages, new kind of ways of dividing up a paper, new ways of writing that are more in keeping with a qualitative ethos. And finally, and probably most importantly, qualitative researchers need more knowing reviewers. As I previously mentioned, what we've looked at is peer-reviewed research. It's research that's gone through a review process and an editing process, so it's been signed off by several people. And we clearly need reviewers who have a better understanding of TA, of a better understanding of qualitative research, a wider methodological bandwidth, so they can help reviewers, they can help authors, understand what good practice looks like. So with that in mind, I just wanted to highlight a paper that Ginny and I have written on quality in TA called One Size Fits All: What Counts as Quality Practice in Reflexive Thematic Analysis, and it includes a tool for evaluating TA manuscripts. And we'd really encourage people, if you're reviewing TA manuscripts, to have a look at this tool and to kind of work through the questions. It's not a kind of checklist, it's more these are some things to think about when you're reviewing TA research. And here are the references.